Setting up our meeting.
Are we live now?
I believe so, but let me look.
Whole nother world.
It is a whole nother world. We are live now. Okay. Welcome, everybody, and sorry for the technical hiccups there. We're really excited to be here during Climate Week to talk about climate and what we need companies to do about it. I want to start by acknowledging these are really difficult times for everybody, including all of us on the panel. The pandemic and the economic devastation that's come from it are just horrific and obviously really awful for some people in particular. At the same time, the alarm bells are ringing more and more loudly on climate. I'm in San Francisco. I've lived through more than a month of horrible air quality from these unprecedented wildfires we've had in the West. After several years of longer and more intense wildfire seasons, we've got wildfires across the West, especially the coastal states, but also, the mountain states. And it's not just fires. We're seeing more and more massive hurricanes hammering the Gulf and East Coast. We've got flooding, storm damage. We've got extreme heat in many places. And the impacts are being felt disproportionately by poorer communities and communities of color. We're faced with a choice that's becoming clearer and clearer. We can continue with business as usual and see the devastating impacts of this climate crisis accelerate, or we can transition to a zero carbon world where the air and the water are cleaner and we address the inequities that are harming frontline communities around the US and around the world. It's been really wonderful to see the announcements by companies, especially this week during Climate Week and over the last few weeks, stepping up to even more ambitious actions that they're taking, targets that they're setting. And yet it's also clear we need much more than heroic actions by individual companies. This is not a problem that can be solved just by individual actions by people like you and me, by individual companies. We need system-wide decarbonization to cut emissions in half across society by 2030. And that requires public policy in addition to the actions that companies are taking in their operations, their supply chains, and their products to decarbonize at the speed and the scale required to have a hope of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. We need innovations to do this. We need behavior change. We need finance and investment. We need individual action, but most of all, we need political will. We started Climate Voice earlier this year to shift the conversation around public policy on climate. The fossil fuel companies have been fighting climate policy for decades, especially in the US. And sadly, most other companies have been mostly silent, not completely silent, but mostly silent on climate policy. Many are acting in their operations, but when there's an important climate policy on the table in the cities and states and countries where they operate, they mostly stay on the sidelines and stay silent. And that means the fossil fuel companies dominate the conversation with predictable results that we've seen for decades now. It's not enough for companies to say they support the Paris Agreement. That's important. But they also need to use their political influence and muscle to advocate really strongly for specific policies everywhere they operate. We know at the same time that millennials and Gen Z already care deeply about the climate crisis. And you might have noticed I'm not a member of either of those generations. They are looking to work for companies that are more sustainable. And this has been resulting in increased pressure on the companies to act responsibly in order to be able to attract and retain the best talent in a very competitive job market. And even in the face of the pandemic, there are still many companies that are competing really hard to attract top talent. We now need to raise the bar for those companies and get them to step up as strong advocates for the kinds of public policies that will drive the rapid economy-wide decarbonization that we need. We believe at Climate Voice that collective action from employees can really turn the tide. In 2019, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, over 8,000 Amazon employees petitioned the company to rethink how it addresses and contributes to climate change and to solutions. And their collective voice led the company to commit to carbon neutrality by 2040. This initiative was initially conceived by a few really active climate advocates at Amazon, also encourage others in the tech industry to step up and demand change from their employers. We at Climate Voice are building an organization with a mission to mobilize the voice of the workforce, current employees, and also students in their role as future employees, to urge companies to go all in on climate in their business practices and especially in their policy advocacy. So this problem is really urgent. I think, some people say we shouldn't talk about doom and gloom and about how bad the problem is. I was trained as an engineer. I believe if you want to solve problems, you first need to acknowledge them and understand them. But if you don't want to hear the doom and gloom, ignore that part. The problem is urgent, but it's solvable. What we need for that is the political will. And to get the political will, we need to mobilize all the actors, individuals, as well as companies and others who have influence to use it. So today we're going to talk about how to be climate positive in your career, the untapped power of companies, our power collectively to create the future we want and need by amplifying our combined voices. And we will be opening up comments. Please add your questions if you have any as comments in the Facebook live stream. We'll try to answer as many as we can during and especially at the end of the conversation. We also will be running, assuming the technology works, no guarantees, but we plan to run a couple of polls during the live stream, so please be on the lookout for those. Okay, so enough intro and enough from me, because this is not about me. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by 4 remarkable young people, all of whom have been working with us on Climate Voice. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Yo, let's start with you. If you could just tell people your name, where you are in your career, your connection to Climate Voice, and perhaps right now, we'll get into this in a lot more detail, obviously, but right now, one thing for you about how climate connects to your career.
Sure. So I'm Yo. I'm a PhD student in computer science at Harvard. And so the way that I end up thinking about, the way that I came to Climate Voice was really that I freaked out about climate, as I think a lot of us have. And I tried to find what I could do. And my natural instinct as a computer scientist was to ask, what role can the tools that I have play into solving this problem? And so immediately I looked at okay, can we use satellite imagery to study forests? And can we, make various processes for creating cement more efficient and whatnot? And after a little while, I kind of realized that these were all, in the end, they're crucially important. And some of our other panelists are going to comment on that, but they're all bits of the problem. And I asked myself whether I could actually potentially have more impact by taking all of these smart people that I'm around and trying to get all of us collectively to use our incredible leverage with respect to companies to push companies to lobby on climate policy, and whether pushing towards climate policy in that way would not actually be a much more effective use of my time than would working slightly harder on some solution that would really only happen if we had the policy muscle behind it. And so I think that the way that we can make decisions in our employment decisions is crucially important to this climate crisis. And I'm really glad that we're having this panel today.
Awesome, thank you. Camila, how about you?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. My name is Camila. I am an MBA student at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. And the way that I came into Climate Voice it's really a 2-part thing. So one big thing to me, I've always been an outdoor enthusiast. The outdoors have been my playground for a long time. And I've realized over the years how quickly climate change has impacted the way that I do the sports that I like to do outside. So that's one big reason why the environment and climate change is really big for me. And then for the past 4 years, I worked in the tech industry, most recently at Uber, and I saw how impactful they can be, how much leverage they have in politics. Maybe here in California, you've heard of the AB5 and everything that has to do with Uber and how they lobby for their interest in that regard. And I just kept thinking, what can be done so they can also leverage that power to help in the climate change discussions in climate change policy. So that's how I found Climate Voice, also thanks to Shiva here as well. And a big part for me on what's next after my MBA is finding that route that will help me see that impact in the next company that I'll be working for.
Awesome. Awesome. Shiva.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thank you for being here. One, just want to do a quick land acknowledgement and recognize that we're on Zoom, but we are on stolen land. It's important to recognize and to acknowledge and do something about in your local community. And also recognize our ancestors today who can't be with us today, but are with us in many other ways. My ancestry is from India, from Gujarat, in rural part of India. And that's a big part of actually why I'm here today and why I was so glad to have, I think, spontaneously met Bill a couple months ago, and thrilled about what's happening here at Climate Voice. And so for me, I think it's about, I mean, I did a trip to Kenya in 2009. I met with some farmers there who really scared me in many ways because they told me about climate change in words that weren't in a textbook that I was being taught about. And they really scared the lights out of me, if you know what I mean. And so they also gave a lot of advice and wisdom, and taking that back to the US where there has been a growing climate environmental movement, but where communities of color, communities of low wealth, Black, Indigenous communities have been not intentionally brought in. They're not at the front and center. And we've really now in 2020 see the huge, we've been seeing it, but we're really seeing how it's disproportionate. And so that's what brings me here, working class, immigrant background that is really, I think, crucial to this whole conversation, and really grateful to be in dialogue with you all. I'm also an MBA student at Haas with Camila, and I'm moving into sort of finance investments after doing a lot of community organizing and policy work, but I'm very much continuing that, and grateful that Bill is a leader who is really lifting up our struggles, and it's a beautiful thing happening at Climate Voice.
Well, it's beautiful to have all of you as part of it. Natalie.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Natalie Ludwig. I am from Vancouver, Canada. And similar to Camila, I am an absolute outdoor enthusiast. And that's really caused my love for the planet and my need to live a sustainable future and sustainable life. I work in social media strategy at Climate Voice, and it's been amazing, like working with this team and learning from these super inspiring individuals. Climate and career, the combination of them means so much to me because I've worked actually as a model in the fashion industry for the last 10 years. And I definitely felt a disconnect of working in one of the most polluting industries in the world, and really having to understand, how can I educate myself, understand the supply chains, where greenwashing is being used, and live and start to promote more climate positive actions. So I'm a part of a lot of different advocacy groups in New York City, and just really doing everything I can to educate myself and inform the people around me. So yeah, I'm excited for this conversation.
Awesome. So let's start, simple question. What role do you guys think companies should have in climate leadership? How and why should they be part of the climate leadership movement? Yo, maybe start with you.
I think that companies are enjoying the fruits of our society, and that that they are benefiting in many ways from the world that we have, and that honestly we have concentrated a great deal of power in them. Now, regardless of your politics, I hope that you can appreciate the Spider-Man credo that with great power comes great responsibility, and nobody else has been doing it so far. And so we need something to push the policy equation in a way that it hasn't been pushed yet. And I personally believe that the real way for that to happen is for companies that are reasonable and follow the science and have basic even technical understandings of the way that the world is going, will put their money where their rational belief and moral belief is, and really start making climate policy happen across all of the states and the world. And to me, it's it's a no-brainer that this is their responsibility.
Yeah, awesome. Shiva, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I echo that what Yo was saying, and I'll add that it's important, to recognize, even though it's only really coming to light factually in the media now, that the private sector has caused most of this damage, right? In terms of carbon pollution historically, and then again, you could even break that down. You only get to certain handful of actors, and I think one thing is, like, let's not necessarily get caught up on that, but it's accurate reality. And so something has to be done. And I think what's ironic is that the private sector is supposed to have already figured this problem out, right? I mean, technically, if markets were working well, we wouldn't be here today, and we wouldn't even be discussing this issue. So one, it's obvious that there's a ton of market failures, and it's pretty hard to not, you gotta be real about that. But I think second, like, why hasn't the private sector figured this thing out? And there's a lot of reasons. One is, though, and my suggestion and what I'm working on is that I think not only do we need to step up, and there needs to be accountability and recognize that a lot of the money and wealth has been hoarded or is just stored in corporations around the globe and in the US. And they're well positioned to do something about it. And also, communities have the solutions and have been saying a ton of things for a long time. And so it's interesting that the private sector hasn't figured it out. The community, a lot of communities have the answers, and there's kind of just a mismatch. And so I think in terms of corporate leadership, it's really acknowledging the history and getting in the right engagement and deep engagement with the community, and moving from there, which I think is a lot of what Climate Voice and others are attempting to do, and really accelerate it.
Great. I know a couple of you have had jobs. I mean, so Natalie, you've worked as a model, and I think Shiva and Camila, you both had jobs and are now back in school. I think, I think you've gone sort of straight through, right? But so you all have had some experience in companies. I'm wondering what your perspective might be on how things have changed in traditional companies, how companies might have begun to embrace climate policy, or where you're seeing some glimmers of hope maybe there. Camila, maybe you could address this.
Yeah, I think companies and traditional companies have changed so much over the past few decades. Before, and probably like the generation before us and the one before them, people used to stay at a company for 10, 15 years at a time. And they would go there to grab a paycheck and then go home to their family. But because of the ever expanding amount of companies emerging, people have a lot more freedom to hop around. And something that you, Bill mentioned, is that they have that the people just are asking more, and so like. So what's happening now is that employees are asking more of their companies. And because of this, traditional companies are now have to do things to benefit their employees as well, whether that's providing benefits, but that hasn't been enough. What we have seen is that they are now having to be more and more engaged with everything that's happening around them, whether that is with clothing, for example, making sure that companies are being ethical and that they're being sustainable. And so because of this shift that employees are asking more and more of their companies then are needing to adapt to that as well, and making sure that they are also putting their foot forward on things like climate policy. Though it has been a very small change, I do think that is something that is happening slowly.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things, I mean, so you're a computer scientist. Natalie, you've been a model. Each of you has different, sort of areas that you're working in. I started my career in computer science and shifted to working in sustainability, and was lucky enough to really make that shift. But most people can't work directly in sustainability. There aren't that many sustainability jobs at any given company that might have a sustainability department. It's usually pretty small. At the same time, if you're concerned about climate and you want to have your career be aligned with helping address the climate crisis, maybe you guys could each talk about how you can pursue a climate positive career without directly pursuing a career in sustainability. I mean, those who are lucky enough to do that want to really do that. That's great. But you might be passionate about something else in terms of what you want to do every minute of every day. So maybe Natalie, you could start, and then we can just go around the virtual room, if you will.
Virtual room, love it. Yeah, so like as I mentioned, I definitely felt an identity crisis being a climate advocate and then working in the fashion industry. And I think what I really learned is you need to voice what matters to you to make sure your company, or for me, my agency, understands my values, the type of organizations and designers I want to work with. And that can be said when you're looking for a job, like especially in the interview process, ask the right questions, show what you care about. And that together through that, we will be able to create more of a just and sustainable future. And I think especially with COVID, a lot of, at least in the fashion industry, a lot of companies are closing down and the system is going to shift drastically. And so we get to choose how we rebuild and how things will look moving forward. And that needs to be done with climate consideration at the forefront. So yeah, for me, alongside my career, I made sure I was participating in a lot of community action. A few of my friends at NYU and myself, we started an organization called The Void and created a podcast just as a way to like elevate voices, educate others, and just have the conversations that we were having in our daily meetups. So people felt like they had that community, even if they felt like they really couldn't reach it directly. So we would kind of meet up at a local bookstore every week, brainstorm ideas, come to each other with our problems, and really just try to participate in action in the city. So I think there's so many organizations like that. If you go online, like obviously Climate Voice has amazing tools online as well to really understand the problem, understand the policies. So yeah, for me, just be a nerd and educate yourself fully.
Yeah, awesome. Shiva,
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate that. And I think, for me, I think it's similar, right? Like, I don't know if I've ever had a traditional role in sustainability. If you look at my resume, it's kind of weird. I've had a lot of different roles, and sometimes you got to make up the roles as you go, as in not like me making up jobs, but, other organizations and the movement and consulting contracts come up, right? So I think the idea is like, for me, what's worked is, just get involved locally, like what's happening in your community, that matters and is affecting low income folks, low wealth, Black and Indigenous and brown folks. What is happening? And there's a lot happening. So just pick a couple before you get overwhelmed. And I think like, yeah, finding the different avenues of volunteering, interning, also just like, I don't think until this year, I was actually convinced that I could get a multi-decade career doing the things that I love, serving my community. I think this year, for many reasons, personally and professionally and collectively, it is really possible. And actually, there's a ton of them. But like Bill is saying, there's only a few, usually a handful or two corporate sustainability roles. But I would just implore everyone, like, there's a ton of different ways, like Natalie was saying, and those things will definitely lead to other things. And a lot of jobs are being created right now, and we're defining them. The youth is defining that future. The mid-level, entry-level folks are defining that. So it's like, I just think there's a ton of ways, and just link it back to the local community and you and your community, and find ways to engage. And trust me, like corporations are trying to find ways to hire you and create new roles. So I think it's just showing that, and linking that to your personal and collective purpose, I think is really important. Yeah. I think also just real quick, before I pass it on, but intersectionality is really important, right? So linking whatever environmental climate issues to other things, housing, police violence, right? There hasn't been justice for Breonna Taylor, and there won't be environmental justice until Black folks and lives really do matter and are part of the conversation. So I think that's another way that those types of roles could also, right, racial equity roles at organizations, they need to have a climate justice perspective. So I think those are maybe other ways, but that's kind of how I try to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, these intersecting problems, they're hard to solve individually. And in fact, I think that though it's a bigger problem when you look at them together, it may actually be more possible to address them. And the, racial justice and environmental justice are closely linked. They're tied together. Completely agree. Camila.
Yeah, I everything that Shiva and Natalie said is awesome. And something that I would add to that as well is, and something that comes to the question is how you can pursue a climate positive career. There's two ways that you can really do it as well. Is one, the climate energy sustainability space is huge. You can maybe find, if you really like computer science, for example, like Yo, and you want to be an engineer, or if you really like marketing and want to sell a product, there's products that are ethical, that are sustainable, that are pro-climate, positive climate, that you can engage with if you have the ability and the privilege to be able to choose where you're able to work. And then the other thing within that privilege of being able to choose the companies that you apply to is that you can do some of that research. Like we mentioned, Climate Voices has a ton of resources in their website, but you can also look up what other companies are doing in terms of climate change and see, okay, what companies match my beliefs and what I want to do, so that I can maybe go and work there and see what kind of other titles or positions they have that don't have to actually be within climate.
Yep. Great. Yo.
Yeah, so I think I would really echo Shiva's point about intersectionality and about the importance of understanding the connections between all of these different like conflicts that we are, in some sense, like all fighting simultaneously. I will draw some inspiration for the way that we can think about our roles in companies from a recent other fight, which was the fight for marriage equality and LGBT rights. And if we look historically at the way that became a fight that was not just supported by, but sometimes driven by corporate America, we can really take inspiration for how the climate movement can get companies on board in the same way. So 350 companies, I believe, this is a number that one of our Climate Voice members likes to bring up a lot because she was integral in this movement. 350
I think it might have been
filed an amicus
around
brief.
370, but yeah.
370 filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court when the actual marriage equality lawsuit came up. And in general, if you think about the North Carolina bathroom bill, companies actually boycotted the state and forced the state to change its law in an emergency session because they like brought their policy muscle and their economic power to bear on issues, and they could do the same on climate. And so I want us and you to think about the way that those companies got to that decision. It's certainly an interesting story, but an integral part of that was the people at those companies forcing those companies to feel the pressure. Whether it was the sustainability folks in the team, whether it was people in ordinary teams around the company who were LGBT or allies, or who attended groups or created groups, or in general had conversations and spoke to anyone they could think of. In any company, no matter the industry, like climate has some sort of impact, but more broadly, people in that company care about the fate of the climate. And so there is absolutely a legitimate reason to bring it up and to talk about it and to start building that momentum so that when we need our proverbial amicus briefs filed, that like your company will be there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I agree. That's a great analogy and sort of playbook to draw from in terms of companies were being very responsible and let's call it progressive on LGBT rights 10 years ago in their own operations. And they were mostly on the sidelines when it came to public policy. And that shifted because of pressure and encouragement from employees was the big reason. And companies, they weren't the only reason that things have changed then in terms of policy, but they were a big reason, especially in those state level fights where they basically forced, what I consider, many people considered bad laws were passed and they got undone. So I think that is absolutely the kind of thing we need to get companies off the sidelines on climate as well. So let's shift a little bit and talk about, we've got, I think dozens, maybe as many as 100 people watching the live stream right now. Some of them are probably relatively junior and early in their career, some are later. Let's focus on early career people for a little bit. how can they, not me, I'm not quite so early in my career, educate themselves, make their voices heard when it comes to climate action and especially climate advocacy needing to be a top priority for companies. Natalie, maybe we could start with you on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of it comes down, yeah, of course, to educating and reading, understanding the fundamentals and the statistics and rates at which, if we don't make drastic change, we won't be able to come back from it. So, for example, that we need rapid decarbonization of a 50% reduction by 2030, for example. Like, just people need to understand the facts to understand how dire it is. And I think a lot of that comes down to also talking to your peers, talking to your family. Of course, the societal shift is really what's going to create the change, and companies that can lobby governments to implement systems to reduce carbon emissions and all of those things. But it also comes down, I think, to individual action and really implementing that into your day to day and living by those standards and letting that trickle through the people that you surround yourself with. So, yeah, I think reading, talking to people, and really just teaching yourself what's going on.
Sorry, Yo, what are your thoughts?
So I think that there are a number of ways that people who either don't have jobs or who have early career jobs and are still looking can really bring the pressure and push companies in the way that they engage with those companies. So I'll leave it to Camila to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing on like directly how you reach out to companies. But I think that there's a lot of work to be done in the kind of the mindset, both of the companies that you're looking for, of the way that you talk to recruiters, of the way that you generally respond to the stimuli that companies pick up on in like their internal metrics, right? One thing that a friend of mine brought up when we were brainstorming how she could do this at her company was that one of the like simplest, least effort things that you can do is just like start a recycling group, or like join a recycling group if it exists, and like push it just a little bit more, bit by bit, to take more and more ambitious things. And you'll find that like once you start getting serious about making pushes within the company, the most important thing is going to end up being that like infrastructure and social like network and gathering point that you've built. And that's going to matter just as much as any number of well-crafted arguments in terms of getting things moving. And so you can start that as an intern if you want, right? You can start that at any time, and it's up to you. And we're of course happy to help if we can.
Yeah, Camila, Yo mentioned some thoughts you might have, so go for it.
And something that I will add before that as well, just kind of in my own experience while working in the tech industry, is that even if you just started out, and especially I started working only 4 years ago, and when you start out, something that you can do is also look up, there's always directories, employee directories that you can look for, and find those people who might be in the policy side of your company, maybe program managers, maybe you have a sustainability program manager within your company, and schedule a coffee chat. People are always willing to chat. They want to hear more about what others within the company have to say. So it doesn't hurt for you to find out what they're doing, because maybe you just don't know what they want to do, and maybe get involved that way. And it can be just a very adjacent thing to your job. Maybe you're working with them 1 to 2 hours a week, and that's something that is really powerful. And then maybe once you have a little more courage to do something else, maybe as you mentioned, you can start a club, and it's so easy to be able to get involved in how companies are now working with ERGs and things like this. And then if you're starting into your career and maybe you're a recent college graduate, or you're a senior or about to graduate, things that we're doing, especially you and I are the student recruitment team, is that you can always talk to in career fairs with recruiters. You'll be able to talk to them, ask them more about policy, ask them more about what their specific company is doing. And this will trigger something in their minds, if enough people are doing it, to go and ask back in the office, hey, a bunch of these college kids are asking me what we're supposed to be doing, what we're doing on climate change, what are we doing on climate policy? And, we have, our voices have power, and us collectively also have power as well. So making sure that, one, you're an advocate to your peers, but also outside in just career first and things like that in the world.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, all of those are good points. That last one, I think a lot of people might not realize that the questions you ask, the things you express interest in when you're talking to a recruiter or in an interview matter. Companies pay attention to that. They actually track that kind of thing. And so if a lot of people are asking questions about climate policy and how the company engages, the company's going to hear about that. And that will start to get them to start to shift what they're doing. So I think that's a particularly critical one. What about maybe you guys could say a little bit about if you're already an employee. I think you mentioned, like, have coffee with people, talk to them. I think that's certainly one of the things I learned, maybe a little too late in my career, but that arguments based on data are important, but also connecting with people one-on-one and understanding what matters to them and helping them understand who you are. Maybe talk a little bit about that kind of, inside the company, what you can do, whether it's a one-on-one or if the company has town halls or larger meetings, what you can do in those kinds of contexts. Maybe Shiva, you could start.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think a big part of it is what Yo and Natalie and Bill are saying, right, around how do you build that social infrastructure within your company, your organization, that over time, and not too much time, right, because we don't have too much time, but over time, that social infrastructure, informal or formal, whatever it means at your company, is well equipped and positioned to take the action that you want. This decade, it's climate. Next decade, it's this, whatever it is, right? But I think it's exactly that. Like, find your allies, find the people who are speaking out here and there, and then figure out where they channel that energy and those perspectives. Maybe it's outside of work. Maybe it's on a book group. Maybe it's maybe they're writing a letter to change some policy, and that's happening behind the scenes. And it's just a trusted, close-knit circle that's really reviewing that letter to administration or the executives. I think, like, it's got to be that. You've got to genuinely connect with people in your organization. And I know that can be hard because for a lot of us, the corporate sector and roles aren't made to really welcome us and aren't accessible and culturally appropriate or welcoming. So, but find your people. There's some of them. Even if there's just one or two other people, find them, figure out at work, after work, and what do y'all care about? And what is in your realm to change and what isn't? And if it's not, find a more senior ally who may or may not be on your side. Play it carefully, understand the risks that come from being too bold or more bold in your executive leadership, and figure out ways and learn from your elders in the organization around how to approach that. Yeah, that would be one of my things. But I think others, especially Camila, might have some things about how do you really bring it together in the more formal corporate setting. But I would just highlight, do everything on the informal side until it becomes formal. But I'm sure there's other things like committees and chair of a committee or this and that others could speak about.
Yeah. Camila, you want to say a little bit about the sort of more corporate structure or whatever occurs to you?
Yeah, definitely. And corporate also within the tech industry. I'm not sure how other corporations are, but I'm pretty sure some of it might be similar. And I know that you touched upon, yes, those coffee chats that we talked about, finding an advocate, maybe that's a little more senior. And something else that we mentioned within town halls, a lot of companies have all hands where everyone's present, and then they will allow some space for you to ask questions in a chat that then will be upvoted by other employees, and then those questions will be answered. And this is such a simple, very low-key way for you to just see if there's any interest. You simply type up whatever question you might have to your C-suite, and they may be able to get to your question if enough people upvote it. And that also just gives you an indication of how many people are interested in this. It will also, if they if you're lucky enough that they'll answer the question, you'll also gauge a little bit more about what the company is actually trying to do. And something that I wanted to also emphasize is that when it comes to this theory of change, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a very slow process. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as we've talked about in a lot of different ways, especially during COVID and everything that's happening. But just emphasizing that these are little steps that overall, once you aggregate them, they're going to end up having a very big impact. You just need to be patient and know and persist that something's going to happen if you put their good effort into it.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And any quick thoughts from any of you in the sort of COVID era, when many people, obviously not all essential workers are not remote, but many of us are remote. It's harder to connect with people over coffee. Thoughts on how to find allies and have that kind of influence in an organization when so much is less connected than it was, and any ideas or suggestions there? Anybody?
Well, I'll just quickly jump in, but I think it's obvious, but take advantage of all the social networking and channels, right? So whatever it is, whether it's Slack, Twitter, emails, Zoom, for me, it was like, all right, I'm uncomfortable with some of these platforms. Let me find the ones I'm good at or I like, and let me just spend more time being intentional on those platforms about who I'm connecting with and about what. So take advantage of that, narrow down your platforms, get off your screens, because we all know we're on them too much. But when you are on your screen, like, make it intentional. And like, if you're chatting with someone on a Zoom webinar, follow up on LinkedIn. I don't know, I've done that like 10 times, and they'll end up emailing me or setting up a call or something. So just figure out that way, to kind of get in and do what works for you, and recognize too that it is a lot, and be easy on yourself, that social media is absolute wild. But just try to find those channels that can work for you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, especially being in a college environment now in the virtual space. There are so many different like Slack threads and more sustainability focused groups you can join. And it's really about just talking to your friends. Like right before COVID, I was trying to mobilize with 7,000 people in the fashion industry, because it said that if you have like 3.5% of the population on board, a social justice movement has never failed. So we were trying to mobilize and create a strike for climate justice. Now that's completely shifted to online, but we've still been able to like keep up that email chain correspondence, brainstorm ideas, ways we can help out virtually. And I really feel like it's just having those conversations. It's hard to do on your own. It really takes a village. So just be open and receptive to people that come across your path.
Something that I will add to that too, and again, this is coming from a position where in the tech industry, we just have so many resources. In some ways, COVID and being able to work from home and having this digital connection with people has made it a lot easier for us to be able to send out massive announcements about something that you want to do. For me, as someone who was on the lower end of the hierarchy of a tech company, I would be able to go into any of the ERG club Slack channels and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm very interested in this. Anyone else? It's a lot easier to do that over, at least for me, over a message to a bunch of different Slack channels than trying to go and figure out, okay, who can I talk to that I can make an announcement and do something else? This has just put it all into one computer rather than me trying to go into different places around a campus or a building or anything like that. So in a lot of ways, it has helped. And people are a lot more willing to talk to you just because they do want some of that interaction.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And the fact that, I mean, if you're in a company that is spread out over many locations, either across a metropolitan area or around the country, around the world, I think that a lot of people used to be mostly in touch with people near them because you had physical proximity and those are the people you built relationships with. Mm-hmm. Now with many people being remote, it kind of levels that playing field and it opens up access to people who are maybe physically farther away. And I think that's a good thing. So yeah, there are pluses and minuses. Maybe we could shift gears just for a few minutes. So you guys are all relatively early in your careers. Let's talk about, for the people who might be listening either live or to the recording later, let's talk about for senior level attendees, people who might be in higher up in the hierarchy, in positions of more power and influence in an organization. What would be your message to them be? What should they be doing to support the young people who are clearly increasingly concerned about climate, about all of the intersecting issues, as Shiva pointed out? It's not just climate as a technical problem, it's justice, it's racial justice, it's economic justice, it's environmental justice. What would your message to those senior people be about how they should be supporting, interacting with younger people who are raising these kinds of issues? Shiva, maybe you could start.
Yeah, I love this question. And first, I think if any of those folks are here, like, thank you, right? Like, that's what it's about, starting to listen to younger voices, to voices and people that don't look like you, don't come from backgrounds and places like you, that don't face conditions like you, or maybe they do in some ways. So I think it is really opening up that space of inclusivity and belongingness for communities that have been left out for way too long. Like, why have we worked at your company and you're literally telling us now that we matter or you want to do something? You know how like sad that is to even go through a process of DEI when you're on like the low income, low wealth, people of color and Black, Indigenous like spectrum. It's awful because you're just like, wow, my organization came together in 2020 now, and they're trying to do, okay, great. I think it's we're learning about it in business school, and I really appreciate Haas for that. It's the corporations and corporate leaders have to create an inclusive environment. Your incentives need to be structured right. Your interview processes need to be structured and fair and equitable. You need to bring in the right people, and which means all of us, and specifically the people who haven't been able to thrive at your companies or don't even make it there. And then you've got to go above and beyond for the next infinity amount of years to make sure that we feel good and we're thriving. And some companies have that down and some don't. And I think the other thing I'll just mention is that leadership in this space is so crucial. One, that it's such a bubble. I'm coming from the other side, a community public sector bubble, which is a bubble itself. Private sector is maybe a worse bubble, but we need to get out of our bubbles and listen not only to the youth and the wisdom from our elders, but the social justice movements and communities. And so we've got to learn and listen to them and put them into leadership, and then recognize that even progressive leadership in the climate space, let's be honest, I love progressive leadership here, but even that is way behind the mark, and that's the baseline. So we got to keep going from the most ambitious leaders in clean energy and climate. They're doing a great job right now, but we've got to go 100 times farther, I believe, and 100 times quicker.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, the point I think you're right. A lot of companies and environmental organizations have been slow to come to the table around racial justice and lots of other issues. They're getting there. They still, I think many of us have a long ways to go still. I think that one of the things I've learned when I think about how companies approach this and many other organizations is that if you really care about justice, you have to actually cede power to the people who are most affected and give them a real seat at the table in designing solutions. It can't be, I'll listen to them and then tell them what the solution is, but it's what I think the right answer is. You really have to, it's about access and being part of the process. So, okay, we're coming towards the end. Let's start with some Q&A from the audience, which is great. We've got some questions coming in. First one is from Joe. How do you force companies to go beyond the typical greenwashing statements and actually take concrete action? So who'd like to jump on that to start?
I'll jump in. I know I've been talking a lot and I'll be quiet, but Joe, I think this is Joe Bearden from North Carolina. Appreciate your leadership and your work there, Joe. I think for me, and we know this question is really important. I think the only way you go beyond greenwashing is by getting our people in their top leadership, as well as our people externally really engaging and holding them accountable and restructuring and reforming these companies. I mean, I would love the world that some of these companies didn't exist, but I'm not that powerful and smart enough. So I think if they're not going to go away, we're not going to build new cooperatives, community-based enterprises, social enterprises. If we're not going to replace them, then if anyone wants to stay around, we've got to hold the bar higher. We've got to seriously change leadership, and we've got to restructure. I mean, look at PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. I mean, it's playing out. And if they want to stick around, they're going to have to look completely different, and not just change a name or an executive. So until that happens, I just don't think we accept much less. So policies and plans are great, but I think to the point of greenwashing, until there's actual action that the community feels good about, and broadly, and low income, low wealth communities of color feel good about, then we got to keep pushing the bar.
Great. Second question, as we decarbonize our economy and push companies to speak up for green growth, how can we ensure that the economic transition is a just one? And we've been talking about this a bit, that not only protects minority and frontline communities, but also lifts them up. Camila, Natalie, we'll let Shiva be quiet for a minute.
Although I feel like Shiva would have a really great answer for this as well. I think he has worked a lot on these issues throughout his career, so I would like to hear what he has to say as well. But something that we just need to look at and really understand is how we can get those specific communities involved. Most of the time we do it from this higher side, like this top down kind of approach to it, where we know who's on the top. It's usually the most privileged of the society. So that's how we've been seeing that our minorities and low income folks, frontline communities have been taken out of the equation. So then we need to get them a lot more involved when it comes to transitioning to green growth, and making sure that they are being accountable for, and that they have that sense of belonging within within anything that we'll be doing to drive that.
Awesome. Shiva, you want to add anything quick?
No, but just recognize that my background is an image created from Jessica Tovar, a community leader from Oakland. And I think like what Camila is saying is that's it. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Okay, next question. Sometimes it's the rich who can afford to change their shopping practices. The poor can only go with those companies that produce their products super cheap, which means companies that exploit the environment and probably workers the most. What do you recommend the poor should do?
My personal take on this question, and I'm open to hearing and interested to hear what the other panelists say, is that the truth is that the people for whom it is incumbent on them to act are those who have the option power, who like can choose between options and can thus force these companies to compete with each other over which one they will go with. Like, I am not here to tell someone who has like a single place that they can realistically get a job at that they should not take that job because they don't like that company's climate stance. But the truth is that a lot of people do have that leverage and they are not exercising it, and they could. That said, like, I don't think the goal here at all is to beat up on people who just don't have choices, because they are doing everything that they can just to get by.
Yeah, I would actually tie that back to the whole premise of Climate Voice, which is, there are lots of companies. There's smaller companies that are struggling. They may not have much influence, and we're not asking them to suddenly go hire a bunch of lobbyists and use their influence that they might not have much of. The same is true for workers or consumers, that if you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice, but we are asking those who have power and influence of one form or another to be allies and use it to help solve these problems. These are system problems. They're not just about individual choice. And so people who don't have choice, it's about changing the system so we can all, in the end, have better choices. as opposed to basically having those with privilege make better choices and then, sort of calling out the others for not being able to make choices. So I think that in some ways they're very, very related. Okay, one more question. We might have time for one or two more. How do we get funders to shift to funding youth climate groups, which are having way more success in driving increased media attention, changing narratives, and holding policymakers accountable, as opposed to just the mainstream big groups or giant clean tech corporations? Shiva, you got a quick one on that?
Yeah, real quick, and I saw another question too, but I think it's again going back to one of the previous questions that like we need to listen to the youth, understand the priorities, and reflect and respond our funding and engagement appropriately. There's a bunch of folks out there doing it. One decent example that I've been learning of, great example actually, is Exposure Labs. And so a production company that is getting even more creative and engaging with youth and communities of color, building non-traditional partnerships as part of a film production company. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So we got to get creative and take that listening to the youth into tangible, fundable, new ways of doing things and create real assets and not just like reports, grant reports.
Awesome. Looks like I actually missed one, went by in the chat and I missed it. So let me go back to that. What have you found effective in changing the minds of friends and family? And I would actually add to that colleagues, some of whom may be friends. But Natalie, you want to
Yeah, I
answer
can
that?
speak to that, definitely. For me, I'm a big proponent of before I come home for Christmas time and things like that, I love to send a mass email of like, these are the ways that I'm going to live while I'm here. And like, I hope you'll join me. I feel like I've always gotten great responses from that, and not necessarily saying you're doing it wrong, especially with like, I don't know, my parents are like the older generation, but saying this is what's happening now. And like, these are the steps I'm taking. I hope you'll join me. So yeah, whenever I'm with them, we tend to talk a lot about like current events happening. When I'm giving gifts, I love to give more sustainability focused gifts so that they can start to see the little shifts that they can make in their day-to-day, and then hopefully start to proceed differently.
Awesome. That's fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, I think Catherine Hayhoe is a famous climate scientist, I think at Texas Tech University. One thing she says is one of the most important things you can do about climate is talk about it with your friends, your family, anyone in your sphere of influence, your coworkers, your boss, the executives at an all hands or whatever. Keep raising it. Make sure that, if we're all silent about it, not much will change. Okay, so let's move to kind of closing remarks from each of you, particularly call to action. So for people who are listening, what do you want to leave them with? Maybe Camilo, we could start with you.
I am going to leave you with a quick plug to join our Climate Voice Student Ambassador team. So if you are maybe even a recent grad, or you are still currently a student and want to see how you can get involved, message us. Not sure how it will work. Maybe if you put in the chat phase of the Climate Week Facebook group, come and join us. We have a ton of different resources for you to be able to get started on this in your respective universities, college, JCs, anything like that. So that's my call to action for all of you.
Awesome. Yo.
I want to just, first of all, thank you all for listening to this. And second of all, highlight that everything that we've talked about here has kind of been like life advice and maybe a little abstract in some ways. And so I think that it's worth concretizing. There is really going to be like 1 3-year stretch that is going to determine how this goes for us for a very long time. And it is like the next 3 years. And so when we talk about, oh, we should get companies to speak up on climate policy, we don't mean in like 2030, we mean like in 2021. And that means that if you want to have any impact on this, like we are talking about talking to someone or bringing something up at a company like tomorrow or today, but it's a little late. And yeah, I want to highlight that this is not abstract. This is like urgent and this is happening now. And every little thing that you do pushes each of these companies a little closer to acting, and that pushes us a little bit farther down the eventual temperature like stabilization. And so like it matters, and we have to do it right now.
Mhm.
Yeah, awesome. Natalie.
Well, thank you guys so much for listening. I definitely want to acknowledge that climate anxiety is very real, and people are definitely struggling a lot mental health wise. But I would encourage you or challenge you today just to have like one conversation surrounding your feelings on climate change right now, and really get the ball rolling and get involved, create that ritual of communicating with your peers.
Awesome. Shiva.
Yeah, echo all of this and add that I really encourage us all to really listen to, authentically engage, and hold ourselves accountable to people and communities and things that don't look, feel, or are like us. And if that's an issue, or if that's really hard to do in your life with your friends, family, and professional work, that's a great place to start. And if there aren't people around you that you're not able to hold yourself accountable to, that don't look and live like you, I think it's a hard thing. So I'll just leave there, and I find inspiration in all my mentors and communities through that.
Great. Okay, so thank you to our panel. This has been awesome. Thank you everyone who's joined us either live or might be listening later. Our website, climatevoice.org, you can go there. There are a bunch of resources to learn about what kinds of policies companies should be supporting, what you can do as a student or as an employee. Climatevoice.org, it's not Climate Voices, Climate Voice, just to be clear. I hope I think most of you probably came here with a sense of urgency about the climate crisis. I hope you walk away with still a sense of urgency, but also an increased sense of hope and optimism and empowerment that there is more that we can do than maybe we thought we could before. So thank you all for listening, and enjoy the rest of the week. Take care all.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Everyone, thanks so much.